Do you ever have one of those moments when a series of events leads to a choice? A seemingly insignificant one. But after you make that choice, you realize that everything in your life has shifted somehow. You can't put your finger on it, but later, this is going to be important. You can feel it. I'm talking about something small, very small, like driving down the road, seeing a used bookstore, and turning into the parking lot small. Let me tell you why I'm so excited. The other day, my audio and tech guy, Richard, and I found ourselves in a used bookstore. There was interesting stuff everywhere, but it wasn't until an hour of browsing later, when we were just about to leave, when I turned to see a 26-volume set of very antique-looking books. Every cloth-bound, hardcover tome was wrapped in delicate acetate paper and slid into its own hard sleeve. The volume number and name of an area in Japan written in Old Japanese was embossed on the spine, along with the words, Nihon no Minwa, Japanese folklore. My jaw dropped. This was perfect, because I've just finished my 50th monthly bedtime story over on Patreon. And I'm really proud of those stories. They run the gamut from old favorites like Hintaro and Bunbuku Chagama to more obscure tales like The Three Devils and The Oil Seller's Daughter. But very recently, I haven't been super excited about what I'm finding. It feels like the stories are many times removed from the original tale. Kind of like how fairy tales change over the years and lose a bit of their edge, their bite, and their magic, if you ask me. A lot of time, these folktales are written for children to be read by children. Think modern-day Grimm's fairy tales compared to the originals. So after pawing over this book find, there was a momentary pause because we've been out of work for over a year now and ends aren't always meeting. So I don't really like to spend money, but Richard was like, get them, and that was that. So I want to give a huge thanks to him, but also for my patrons for this treasure trove. And they'll be reaping the benefits because I'm going to start translating these folktales for the monthly bedtime stories. I've just begun to dip into the volumes, but I'm finding the storytelling much more interesting and way better written than what I'm used to. And since I do a story time here on Uncanny occasionally, I want to read one of the tales today. Because it's hard to choose, I just grabbed the first volume, opened it randomly, saw a sketching of a Kappa, and chose that one. So today I'm going to tell you a brand spanking new Kappa folktale that came from up near Akita Prefecture. This is one that I've personally never heard before, and I'm guessing you haven't either. But that's not all. In order to understand part of the story, I get to tell you a very curious phenomena and Japanese phrase that involves blue butts. And also how I almost ended up in an Arkansas jail. Uncanny Japan is author me, Teresa Matsura, exploring all that is weird from old Japan. Strange superstitions and old wives' tales, cultural oddities and interesting language quirks. These are little treasures I dig up while doing research for my writing, and I want to share them with you here on Uncanny Japan. I hope you like the show. Hey. Today's story time here on Uncanny Japan, and I'll be sharing with you quite literally the first tale I translated from my new, old, and very precious collection of Japanese folklore. It's called The Kappa's Abyss, and it was a joy to read and translate. But while reading, I came across a Japanese phrase that I've always loved for its weirdness So I thought I would share that with you first. There's a phrase in Japanese, and maybe you've heard of it. It's shiri ga aoi, or ketsu ga aoi, literally meaning that someone has a blue butt. It's used to say that someone is very young or immature. But what does having a blue butt have to do with someone being young, you ask? Well, quite a lot, actually. Some of you, I'm sure, know all about this, but I didn't, so I just want to share. It's quite interesting, actually, and it's what almost landed me in jail, but I'll get to that in a minute. There is something called a Mongolian spot, or MS. Let me just read the first hit I got when I searched for it. Mongolian spots are congenital birthmarks seen most commonly over the lumbosacral area, think lower back and bottom. They are bluish-green or black in color and oval or irregular in shape. They are most commonly found in individuals of African or Asian ethnic background. And I'm adding here, I believe they can also be found on people of Native American descent and Southern Europeans. I've read that, but I'm not exactly sure. It's just an accumulation of melanin pigment under the skin, and there's nothing to be worried about. Most of the time, they fade with age. So right there explains it. If you hear someone being told that they have a blue butt in Japanese, it means that they're still very young or immature. In Japanese, they're called mo kohan. But remember the phrase, because although this one's a tiny bit rude, aoketsu, blue-butted, it's going to play a part in the story, which I'll get to in just one second. But first, I wanted to share how I almost got thrown into a country jail in Arkansas. My son Julian was something like 2 years old at the time, and we were back in the States traveling down south to visit some relatives. He had a little stomachache when we left, but the farther we drove, the worse it got, until it was screaming and clawing at the belly bad. We stopped at the nearest hospital and rushed to the ER. This wasn't a big hospital, and it was after hours, so my memory is just of empty halls and a handful of emergency room staff. They had to do a lot of tests, of course, and after a long wait, I was called back to the doctor's office. He shut the door, put his hand on the phone, and leaned forward. Now I've got no idea what's going on, and I'm trying to stay calm. Meanwhile, he's got this menacing look on his face, and he says, "I have one question for you." "Yes?" "What nationality is your husband?" "Japanese. Why?" He breathes a sigh of relief, smiles, takes his hand off the phone, and tells me that he was just about to call the police. What? As it turned out, and I had never thought about it before, Julian's mo kohan were small and dark blue marks on either side of his lower back. The doctor said that one of the nursing staff who was doing tests noticed them and thought that they looked like bruises. He himself had almost called the cops right then and there, except first he consulted with the ER doctor, thank goodness. As luck would have it, the ER doctor just happened to have a Chinese girlfriend and had spent some time in China, so he knew all about these Mongolian spots. And he saw them for what they were. But if you didn't know, they really do look like bruises. So then he asked for a huge favor. "Can I show your son's Mongolian spots to the nursing staff so they're aware of them in the future?" And I'm like, okay. So one of Julian's funny life stories, which he gets to tell, is how he was held backside forward in front of an entire nursing staff, while both the ER doctor and me explained what mo kohan were. The whole thing was a tad surreal and also a very close call. Oh, and also he did have a freaky stomach bug and got the medicine that he needed, and it cleared right up. Okay, on to today's folktale. Remember the Kappa? I talked about it back in episode 48, an aquatic creature with webbed hands and feet, beak, and a tortoise-shell back. On its head, it's got a saucer-type thing filled with water. Well, while their image has been revamped of late to make them more kawaii and lovable, in olden times they were scary and dangerous and big jerks. And this is one of those stories. It's called The Kappa's Abyss. The Kappa's Abyss. It was a sweltering summer, just after noon. There, along the Hay River, a young girl was walking as if she didn't have a care in the world. She was just coming to the Haratai-Fuchi, the part of the river that was gorgeous blue and ran deep and slow. She suddenly had the urge to jump in for a swim, but resisted it. Instead, though, she slowed her pace and dreamily stared at the cool, bottomless-looking water. When something strange happened. There, just beneath the surface, she saw something swimming. It was following her and moving closer to the bank until it was right beside her. Pokari! It popped out of the water. The top of its head looked like a round saucer, and it had a sharp beak for a mouth. The girl knew exactly what it was. It was one of those Kappa that she'd heard so many terrible stories about. But she found she couldn't run away. So shocked was she by the hideous creature poking its head out of the water, ogling her with fiery eyes, that she froze. The Kappa's mouth turned up into a wan grin, and it swam over to this large rock that was half in the water and half out of it, and jutting up right in front of the girl. The Kappa climbed the rock with its slimy webbed hands and feet. Pet-chatty, pet-chatty. Then, something more curious happened. As the creature came to settle itself on the rock, she realized, the closer she looked, it wasn't really a Kappa at all. It was a human, a boy, but a very strange boy. He looked her up and down and laughed in a creepy way. He then took something out of the pouch he had tied to his side. "Ane-san, young lady, you should go to the Ogyo-Fuchi, that deep part of the river, much like this one, but way down there. My older brother lives there. You should give him this." With that, the boy, a constant mean look in his eyes, handed her a letter sealed in an envelope. The young girl, thinking it to be some kind of trick, was relieved when he indeed just handed her the letter and retreated back to sitting on the rock. She nodded. "If you don't deliver this letter or decide to run off while on your way, something very horrible will happen to you." His eyes flashed once more, and he added, "Promise?" The young girl nodded again. After that, the boy turned around, slid down the rock, suru, 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 and with a great splash, disappeared under the surface and into the dark abyss below. The young girl was immediately freed from the spell and was able to move again. She hurried off, afraid to even glance at the river now. She pressed the letter to her chest and continued in the direction of Ogyo-Fuchi. However, when she was halfway to the second deep pool, she heard someone call out beside her, "Where are you going?" The girl stopped and looked. There, resting in the shadow of a tree, sat an old monk. "What are you thinking about so intently?" that you can't enjoy this lovely day?" he asked. The old monk pushed himself up from his meditation and lumbered over to the poor child, who was obviously upset about something. The young girl sized up this strange monk and came to the conclusion that there was no bad feeling or anything suspicious about him at all. She felt safe and told him everything that had just happened back at Haratai Fuji. "Oh, I see. So when the creature's head first appeared from the river, it looked like a kappa. But when it climbed on land and was right before you, it became a human boy. The old monk thought carefully for a few moments, eventually coming to the conclusion, "You are in big trouble, my child. There is something about that letter. Please show it to me." The young girl handed over the letter. The monk pulled out a small knife from his robes and deftly opened the envelope, careful not to tear the paper. When he slid out the letter itself and opened it, they both gasped as they saw that the paper was completely blank. Nothing had been written on it. Was it a joke? The old monk held the empty letter up to the sun, turning it this way and that, squinting. Then he went and examined it under the shade of the trees, shaking it, blowing on it, and rubbing it with leaves, before finally returning to the girl's side and announcing his findings. "This is a water letter. We must look at it in the water." The old monk maneuvered his way down the river bank, squatted beside the river, and splashed some water on the letter. As if by magic, the bold black characters appeared on the paper. This is what the letter said. "This girl you see before you is young and with Aoketsu, so I give her to you for your next meal. Enjoy." On hearing this, the young girl turned pale and began to shake. It was a trap. But she couldn't flee either, or else she'd be caught and something horrible would happen. "Now that was a close call," the monk said. "But don't worry, I'll fix it." And just like that, he went off into a nearby pumpkin field and wandered around until he located the biggest pumpkin he could find. Then he kneeled down in front of it, and after a few minutes of earnest praying, he chopped off the pumpkin's stem and, wielding it like a calligraphy brush, he used the liquid that oozed from the end like ink and carefully wrote something on the Kappa's letter. By the time he returned to where the girl was waiting for him, the paper had already dried and was just as blank as before. Had he even written anything? And if so, what did it say? The monk carefully replaced the paper into the envelope and handed it to the young girl. "There you go," he said. "You can rest at ease. Take this to Ogyo no Fuji and deliver it to the Kappa's brother. Only, there is one thing you must remember. No matter what he says, don't tell him you met me along the way." The young girl thanked the monk profusely, then set off for the next deep river pool. Only she found the trip hard going, as fear slowed her pace. But she had to trust the monk. It was her only choice. Finally, she made it to the second pool, the Ogyo no Fuji. There, too, a large rock rested half in and half out of the water. She imagined that's where she was supposed to go, not noticing the creature lurking in the shadow of the stone, just under the surface of the dark water. It waited until the girl got close to the river bank. Then, pokkari, it leapt from the water and landed by her side. The girl yelped in surprise as the slimy-skinned creature that was unmistakably a Kappa scurried up the rock and turned to face her. In doing so, just as she'd seen its younger brother do earlier, it transformed into a human boy. "I see you have brought me something," the boy said, smiling broadly and pointing to the letter she was holding. He was drooling. The young girl quickly handed it to him and watched as he petted the envelope with his slimy hands. "You really brought it all the way here, didn't you?" The boy cackled in excitement. "Well, let's see what it says." With a long fingernail, or was it a claw, he tore out the blank-looking piece of paper. He ran his damp hands over the letter again and again. Magically, darkly inked characters rose to the surface. But this time, they were the monk's words. The letter said, "Because this girl is young and having a blue butt, as young people do, you should definitely not eat her or harm her in any way. As a matter of fact, what you should do is give her some money and send her on her way." The boy glared at the young girl and reread the letter over and over, getting angrier and angrier until the letter he held in his hands shook. "Ane-san," he said suspiciously, "is this really the same letter my brother gave you back at Harataifuchi?" Of course the girl knew she wasn't supposed to mention the monk who she had met and who had helped her along the way. But also, she'd always been taught by her parents never to lie, ever. It was one of the worst things she could do, they said. The young girl swallowed the lump in her throat and looked at the boy straight in his ugly, flashing eyes and said, "Yes, that is the same letter." "Are you sure? Nothing happened along the way that could have possibly changed this letter?" The girl silenced her parents' voices in her head and said again, "Yes, I am sure." "Oh, my stupid brother!" The boy howled, slapping the rock with one hand. He was so angry that he was turning back into a kappa, his beak snapping in fury. With webbed hands, he shredded the letter and threw it into the river. The young girl was just about to run off as fast as she could when the kappa stopped her. "Don't go anywhere." She froze again, just like before. "Oh no, what terrible thing," she thought. The kappa dove into the deep abyss of the lake. The girl trembled and waited. A few minutes later, the kappa appeared and hissed, "Take this and disappear. I never want to see you again." It threw something onto the shore before vanishing below the surface once more. The young girl was surprised to see many coins glinting in the beautiful summer sun. She gathered them up and hurried away, safe and sound. But something along the Hay River changed from that day after. You see, up until then, the two Kappa brothers had had a deal. When one would come across some young Aoketsu boy or girl, instead of gobbling them up himself, he'd send them with a letter as a present to the other brother, and he would be the one that would feast on the tender young child. This had been their agreement for years and years, and explained all those mysterious disappearances of random children. But after the trick the old monk and the young girl played on them, the Kappa at Ogyo-Fuchi thought his brother was being a big jerk, and they began to quarrel. So much so that the two Kappa never trusted each other again, thus saving countless young, blue-budded children's lives. The end. And that's all for today. Thank you so much for listening. I want to give an extra special virtual bear hug to all my patrons. Because of you, I snatched up my very precious treasure trove of folklore, from which I'll be translating and retelling a tale for you each month. These are stories from all over Japan, and after browsing through the titles, 99% are things I have never heard before. So I'm crazy excited about this. Also, if anyone is interested in getting in on these folktale bedtime stories, you can do so for $5 a month over on Patreon. Just search for Uncanny Japan and Patreon. If you want to hear a non-Japanese story read by me, my other show is Soothing Stories Podcast, so check that out. And if you're interested in Japanese sake, shochu, awamori, whiskey, even gin and rum, we are talking all things Japanese alcohol related, give a listen to the Japan Distilled podcast. Rich Pav is doing their sound, and that aside, we both really love their show and their content. You'll definitely learn something and have fun doing so. So have an amazing day, everyone. Thank you again, and I will talk to you again in 2 weeks. Bye-bye. You've just reached the end of another episode of Uncanny Japan. Perhaps you'd like more. A monthly folktale translated and retold by me. The occasional binaurally mic'd soundscape like the ones you hear on this show. Or recipes, behind-the-curtain episodes, homemade postcards, and more. If you're interested in that or supporting the show in any way, please search for Uncanny Japan and Patreon. We've got a wonderful group over there. Thank you again for listening, supporting, reviewing, and telling your friends about the show. My name is Teresa Matsura, and I will talk to you again soon.